Hello, my name is Adam Kruger, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about one of my favorite books, a little close reading analysis for the first 9 chapters or so. The book is Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. I know you can't really see it on there. It's road novels over here. If you can't see it, it has a bunch of them, including On the Road, Terresta, Subterraneans, Lonesome Traveler, and I believe some of his letters. But Dharma Bums is his 9th novel, and in my personal opinion, his best, even though admittedly I haven't read every single Jack Kerouac novel. I know On the Road is a little more famous, but I picked Dharma Bums for a few reasons. Number one, I picked this because I'm reviewing it right now for a travelogue that I'm doing on my author page, Adam Kruger Author, if you want to follow that. It's a series called Travels of Bramley, and the explanation for all of that is in the foreword if you want to look up that page. But Dharma Bums, to begin with, it takes place around Colorado, and that's where a big section of my recent trip was that I'm detailing in that travelogue, Travels with Bramley. But beyond that, it's also my favorite Kerouac novel. I know On the Road is a little bit more iconic. I think the prose in this is better. His prose got better throughout his entire career. The reason that his later books aren't as iconic or well-known or well-remembered is his earlier books, is almost everything he did was semi-biographical. And as his life went on, he became increasingly more pathetic. He stayed in a lot more. He was a wino, basically. He was a drunk. And novels like Big Sur, while the prose in it are stunning, are excellent examples of why not to become a complete raging alcoholic and wino, because if you do, your life is going to be rather pathetic and uninteresting, as is somewhat evidenced in Big Sur. Not to say that it's a bad book, because it's not, but it's certainly nowhere near as fun as something like On the Road, which has like a kind of kinetic energy derived from arguably its main character, Dean Mortuary, which in real life is Neil Cassidy. His publishers always had a weird thing where they didn't want Kerouac to use the real names. So in Dharma Bums, for example, he is Ray Smith, which is easily his worst alias. His better ones are Cell Paradise from On the Road and Jack DeLuise from a few other things. He kind of wanted to call it the DeLuise legend. He often talked about how later he wanted to go back and edit everything so all the names aligned and everyone had their real names. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that that never ended up actually happening, because it would create far greater continuity and you'd be able to see the evolution of these characters a little bit more clearly. Like Alva Goldbook, I believe, is Allen Ginsberg's name in this. And there's several others, like Cody is Neil Cassidy in this, unlike Dean Mortuary and On the Road. I know it gets all a little confusing, but anyways, on to the more interesting aspects. First of all, Dharma Bums, one of the reasons it's so great to me is not only are the prose a little bit better than On the Road, but also it's a lot more contemplative. He tries to include Buddhist philosophy into his writings and his teachings and his beatnik lifestyle, and he's trying to balance everything with his beliefs as an individual, as a writer, as a beatnik, as kind of a hippie of sorts, along with more classical Buddhist ideals and contemporary Buddhist ideals for the time that this novel was written. It was published in '58, and it takes place shortly after the years of On the Road, so I believe late 40s, early 50s, if I'm not totally mistaken there. But it's definitely a lot more contemplative, as I said. The characters, while the cast is always kind of similar, the focus isn't quite as much on Neil Cassidy and his frenetic, crazy, mad, beatnik ways. The central figure besides the Kerouac figure, aka Ray Smith, in this is a character called Jaffe Ryder, who is a poet, a Buddhist, a philosopher of sorts, an outdoorsman. He's a really interesting guy. Grew up in a log cabin apparently, in I believe it was Oregon, and grew to be this kind of stunning poet, intellectual. He translated lots of poems from one language into another, mostly into English. His favorite that they talk about frequently is Han Chan, and they figure some of his poetry in there, which is just gorgeous, beautiful, breathtaking stuff. And for that reason alone, it's pretty worth checking out. Another thing that I think this is a little more interesting is a lot of the characters don't grind on you as much as Neil Cassidy, because by the end of On the Road you learn to love him and hate him in equal measures, whereas the central characters here, especially Jaffe Ryder, is a lot more likable overall. I think is a lot more interesting, a lot more open-minded. He has a lot more to say. There's definitely a strong theme of philosophy of all sorts, but primarily Buddhist philosophy within Dharma Bums that he kind of weaves throughout the chapters and the discussions. Now, whether or not every one of these ideas and pieces of conversation are legitimate, actual Buddhist philosophies is probably up for someone else to say. I'm no expert in Buddhism whatsoever. From the little I know of it, I think it's definitely interesting, and you can certainly see in how it's presented how Kerouac found these ideas very romantic. Not only was he romantic himself, he liked to experiment with big ideas and different ways to view the world, but also he was a person deeply concerned with the sake of suffering and desire, and to end that nature. Samsara is what is called, the belief that in Buddhism that all life is suffering, and then end suffering, you must end desire. Because Jack Kerouac was a very tormented person. He had a lot of demons, one of the biggest of which that he never actually talked about in his books, unfortunately, in my personal opinion, was that he was an absentee father, and I think that that's something that probably really kind of got him a little messed up as time went on, and probably added some more of his insecurities and psychological frailties, which again, it's a shame that he isn't more honest about that in that sense, because you could look at this whole Deloise legend or his body of work, in other words, as like a, amongst other things, a psychological portrait of a really interesting, complex, very beautiful but flawed man. Anyways, I'm rambling on a little bit, but I wanted to get over a little bit of these first couple of chapters, and that the notion of samsara, for example, it's explored beautifully early on in chapters like 3 or 4 or something like that in Dharma Bums, when Jaffe, the character I was talking about earlier, he brings a young woman. We're not exactly told how young she is, but we believe that she's of age, or I would hope she's of age, but anyways. Her name is Princess in the book. I'm sure her name in real life was something very different, but they called her Princess. Kerouac supposedly had a thing for her in years past, but she's kind of involved with Jaffe now, and they bring her over for an orgy, which just kind of happens out of the blue. And Kerouac reveals that he's kind of tried to dampen his sexual desires because that they call suffering. Jaffe, of course, has something along the lines of, as much as, he's all for Buddhism and he's absolutely mad about it. In fact, that any philosophy that hinders or ignores or diminishes sex, he says, is rather stupid. And this argument, of course, gets Kerouac to be involved in this orgy, which even includes the character Alva Goldbook, I believe, who's really Allen Ginsberg, which is I always think is interesting when I revisit that, because to my knowledge, Allen Ginsberg was just a homosexual, and not to say just a homosexual, but he was a homosexual, and he was primarily, I thought, only interested in men, but he's, from the events of this, if we're led to believe this is all entirely accurate, we could surmise that he is perhaps bisexual or just very open-minded. But anyways, it's these kind of plot devices and happenings, and I don't really want to call them plot devices because we're led to believe that this all happened more or less. But it's these kind of events in the novel that kind of explore these Buddhist ideas and trying to find a place for them in real life, and trying to find answers and a way forward, which in the beginning part of the novel really culminates in their trip up the mountains, where Kerouac discovers that his dependency on alcohol pretty much evaporates as his love for nature and just the feel of being up high in the mountains and with friends and with great discussion really just takes it all to whole new levels. And all of this is really interesting, and he's trying to, through all of it, explore what it means to be a Dharma bum, and he considers Jaffe the ideal Dharma bum of sorts, who, is interested in arts and philosophy and sex and love and feeling good and exploring exploring the Dharma, exploring Buddhist ideals, and trying to find a place for them in this contemporary world. And he's very enamored by this. In fact, one of the first examples of a Dharma bum that he comes across is a literal bum who goes around freight hopping and whatnot and reading pamphlets and writings of Mother Teresa, I believe it is, which he looks at on a daily basis. And he's very simple and very quiet, and very inward and very at peace with everything. And Kerouac starts off the novel with this encounter, and he's kind of trying to make it seem as though he's on this plateau. He's trying to find humility through this, and I think this is one of the things that about religion is really interesting to him, because overall he's an extraordinarily humble guy. He of course has contradictions, like when he says he knows more about poetry than all of these other poets put together, including Allen Ginsberg, who I don't know if you know this or not, but who knew a few things about poetry. So there's all of that. This encounter with the bum as they're freight train hopping and as they're drinking wine, he's trying to set kind of a tone to say that this is where I'm at, and I'm on this humble level, I'm on this Dharma bum level, and this is what I'm aspiring to, and we're going to see how this resolves itself by the end of the novel, is kind of how he intones it. Another thing from the very beginning from this little section is he talks about being in a place where Charlie Parker went mad, and I think the name drop of Bird here wasn't just coincidental, or wasn't just to show off that he knows a few things about jazz, because clearly he does, if you know anything about Kerouac. But beyond that, he's trying to kind of set a tone, as I said earlier, in a more lyrical sense. And this gets into the heart of what I think is most interesting about Kerouac, and most alluring about him is his prose, his writing. If you're someone who is obsessed about plot, you're probably not going to find Jack Kerouac all that interesting. If, however, you find interesting conversations and interesting characters alluring, or those are the kind of things that are going to want to make you read a book, then Kerouac is absolutely for you. But again, I think his greatest skill is just as a writer of prose, because what he does with it is lyrical, it's musical, and it's like jazz. It really is. I mean, it's free form, it goes beyond everything, and he's the kind of writer where if you take a random passage of him, maybe not totally random, but if you find some of his better passages and set it to something like bop, something like jazz, something like Bird, Charlie Parker, because that was kind of his era, and what his obsession was always talking about bop. So it wasn't just any kind of jazz necessarily, although I'm sure he liked all of that. But it was a certain kind of mad, frenetic, beatnik kind of style that really drove him. And you could put that as a soundtrack to any of his readings, and it would almost always work, at least the vast majority of the times. Because what he's able to do is find this lyricism, this musical quality, this free form music that knows no bounds other than, heart, mind, soul, human imagination, and he's able to do such incredible, beautiful, beautiful things with it. I'm going to be talking more about Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums. In the next section, I want to do brief little snippets here. This first one kind of briefly covered the first 9 chapters, at least trying to cover some of the main ideas, some of the main characters of these first 9 chapters. And the next 9 chapters should be up soon. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to the channel. And you can also follow me on my Facebook author page, just Adam Kruger Author, where I'll be having videos, short stories, blogs, and information about my upcoming novel for anyone who's at all interested. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a blessed day.